Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Today I want to bring forth an example of how secularism is a mirage. When we send our kids to study at public schools that are supposed to be secular and void of any sort of religious inclination, this is in fact false. So to give you an example, when I was studying at the Islamic University of Medina, we took classes like psychology and education because part of my major involved conveying the message of Islam to people. So you want to study something like psychology because it can be beneficial to know how people think when you're trying to convey a message to them. Or education, how to teach properly. What are some good, effective teaching methods? So when I had these courses in Medina, at first glance, I thought that they were secular classes, that they wouldn't really have much religious foundation. However, I was completely wrong. So I'll give you an example of how we studied education, methods of teaching at Medina. What do you think we used as a foundation of truth? If we wanted to derive good, proper techniques that were effective for teaching and conveying messages and educating people, what were the sources we used? Well, of course, we used the same sources that Muslims use for everything. The very foundation of every subject that we could think to study in Islam has to be the Quran and authentic Sunnah, teachings of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And that's what we used. And I'll give you an example of how we did that. So in the Quran, Allah uses different techniques for teaching us things. There are ayat where Allah will bring forth an example. Allah also, throughout the Quran, uses stories to teach us lessons, tells us about prophets, about past nations. When we look at the authentic Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, there were times where he used a diagram to teach his companions. There's a hadith where he drew a line in the sand. He said, this is the straight path of Allah. And then he drew lines to the right and the left, saying that these are other paths that go astray. And each of these other astray paths have shayateen. They have devils calling to them. The Prophet ﷺ would use repetition. There are times where he would repeat something 3 times. This was a beneficial technique when it comes to teaching. And there are other examples of a hadith where questions were utilized, where a question would be raised and then the Prophet ﷺ would answer the question. So you can see right off the bat, we're studying something that may have seemed secular at first glance, but once you get into it, you realize that when you study it in the right place, in the right setting, from the right people, it has religion written all over it. The very foundation of it is the Quran and Sunnah, because the best of guidance is the Quran and Sunnah. So why would we look anywhere else first? Now think about if you were to take this subject in a secular setting. You would also want to derive truth. You would want to come to certain conclusions and facts about what are good, effective teaching methods. But what would they refer to? First of all, they would never refer to the Quran and Sunnah. And this is a problem because this should be the first thing that we always foundationally refer to. So this puts students in the habit of never doing that, never mentioning Allah or His Messenger, alayhi salatu wasalam. So if they're not going to refer to the Quran and Sunnah, what are they going to refer to? They are going to refer to human conjecture, science, philosophy. These are the things that they are going to use to derive truth. And students are going to get into the habit of uplifting these things, venerating them, thinking that this is how we reach conclusions, this is how we find truth. We use our human brains and intellects through philosophy, conjecture, and science. So they might teach the exact same teaching methods. They'll teach you about how using examples are effective, telling stories, using diagrams, repeating yourself, asking questions. These are all very beneficial ways to teach. However, they're not going to refer to the Quran and Sunnah, but they might refer to statistics, to experiments, to human philosophies and conjectures. So it's very clear how one methodology It uplifts the Quran and Sunnah. It makes that a foundation. It makes that the lens through which we view the world, where we derive truth, where we find factual information, whereas the other, it refers to human conjecture, philosophy. And we know that human beings are wrong all the time. If we just think about science itself, let's think 50 years ago, 20 years ago, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago. How far off were certain scientific theories and philosophies and conjectures? Today, some of the most basic things human beings struggle to figure out. That's not to say that science is never useful. Of course it is. We benefit from science as Muslims. However, we look at it for what it is. We understand that the Quran and Sunnah, that is the ultimate truth. That is based in divine revelation. Allah knows everything. Allah is never wrong. Whereas human beings, we make mistakes. So what happens is kids, they go to public schools. People are exposed to these so-called secular societies, and they are led to view the world a certain way. And it's something that happens repeatedly throughout their life, throughout their education, until it becomes a foundation regarding how they view things. They start preferring science, philosophy, human conjecture. And to them, that is the highest way to arrive at truth. So what happens when these people, in their core, view the world in this way, and then they start seeing how Islam might conflict with certain philosophies, certain scientific theories? You find people starting to doubt Islam. You find people starting to want to change Islam. You find people apostating and leaving Islam. And what I've referred to thus far has just been subtle examples. Oftentimes there are very blatant and apparent examples about how the so-called secular education system will call people specifically and directly away from religion. I remember just from my own life, when I think about when I went off to college, I had an art history class, and my teacher was showing us a painting of the Virgin Mary and baby Jesus. And she was mocking the painting, saying, "Oh, how could a virgin have a baby? Ah ha ha ha." Acting like only a fool would think such a thing. So me, as an impressionable young college student, I'm thinking, oh, well, this professor is the intellectual here, so I guess people are foolish for believing such a thing. I guess the elites and intellectuals don't believe in this sort of thing. Then that would just be continually re-emphasized throughout my stay at college. I used to overhear some of the staff and faculty and professors talking about religion and about how it's the opiate of the masses. And I had a teacher specifically in the middle of class one day tell us that human beings are animals, just like dogs and cats. I hate to break it to you, but we're animals too. So yeah, sometimes it's subtle over a long period of time, but oftentimes it is very apparent and blatant. So at the very least, this is something that we have to be aware of so that we can protect ourselves. And when we hear these astray ideologies and these false statements, we can identify it and make sure that we protect ourselves from believing it and adopting these flawed views. But really what we should focus on is establishing our own educational systems, our own Islamic schools, our own curriculums. We're the ones who have the truth. We should be using the truth that we have and trying to spread that, rather than turning our backs on the truth and being indoctrinated to disbelieve in what Allah sent to us. May Allah protect us. May Allah guide us. Allah surely knows best. Jazakumullahu khairan. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.